Tug. All right. Can you see my camera okay? Perfect. So first of all, thank you so much, Fiona and Toby, for inviting me to this wonderful audience and sharing my family story and my people's stories and the recipes today. And thank you for each and every one of you who's here to listen to and engage with this lecture. And I prepared a few Google slides, which I have also dropped in the link in the chat already. So let me know if you don't have it. And so I'll go ahead and share my screen. So please give me a moment. Okay. If I could click mute all, do you know if that's going to do anything? I don't know what this, there we go. Okay, so please let me know if you cannot see the presentation that I have pulled up on my screen. And without further ado, let us dwell into how I incorporate the beloved cultural and modern Vietnamese recipes that I grew up with to tell the stories of my family, my people, and my ancestors. Let us gather together under the squash vines, share a few meals today, and learn some wisdoms and stories. So before we proceed, I would like to caution this audience that throughout this lecture, there will be a fair bit of trigger warnings as the nature of my work deals with sensitive topics such as death, colonialism, infertility, war, and violence. And if you're okay with that, then I would like to take the first few minutes to introduce who I am, how I got into the work that I do, and what is the purpose of Under the Squash Vines. And then I'll speak through how I, as a Vietnamese American, strive to represent the beloved Vietnamese food that I grew up with in the light that I believe they deserve, which is beyond the lens of social media fetishization, colonization, and cultural purity. And then as time permits, I would like to share with you a few examples of how I weave the recipes into the heart of my work, which is the stories that I'm here to tell. And then we'll wrap up with a Q&A. And on the last slide, there are some additional resources and links for those of you who are interested. Okay. So who am I? As Fiona said, my name is Nguyễn Thiên Ân. And to say Ân, all you have to do is say the word under without der, and that's Ân. Thiên Ân means God's blessings in Vietnamese. And my parents gave me that name because I was an accident in their mid-30s. And due to my unexpected arrival, my father decided to finally abandon their last attempt to escape Vietnam on one of the ill-fated boats. The boat that they were supposed to get on ended up being foiled by the communist police officers, and everyone on that boat, on that escape plan was sent to prison camp. So I was a blessing in disguise. I was born in 1987 in Vietnam, and I moved to the US in 1997. I'm the creator of Under the Squash Vines, and you can also find me on Instagram and YouTube under the same tag name. And even though most people call me a cook and a gardener, I always make it clear to everyone that I'm neither a professional cook nor a professional gardener. I am simply a philosophical and cultural storyteller who just happens to cook and garden. At the core of my work, I use food and gardening as tools to convey the wisdom and cultures and stories of my ancestors, and also of Mother Nature herself to a modern audience. But today we will focus on the food and the stories of my family. How did it all start? how did I get into the work that I do? So it started on a rainy afternoon on December 2020. My friend Joanna, who was staying with me at the time, was just having a casual coffee chat um, with me in my kitchen. And she asked me a very simple question. How did you end up in the US? And I explained to her that my grandparents, who came by boat to the US in 1975, started sponsored paperwork for me and my parents to come to the US in 1997. So a whole 2 decades apart. And then Joanna was very confused and she asked, well, why did your parents not make it on that boat in 1975 with your grandparents? And I had to explain that because against their will, they were separated from each other on that final chaotic day of the war. And then Joanna kept asking, why? She's a very inquisitive person. And so our little coffee chat ended up being 3 hours long. And at the end of it, after working through every why question, we worked our way backward to the very pivotal moment at the beginning point in our family story when my great-grandfather was shot to death in his own home by French colonizers. And that was only one of the key moments in our stories that shaped the generational trauma that ricocheted throughout the next 4 generations. And so by the end of it, Joanna was astounded and she urged me on, you have to write this down and publish it because this is the kind of stories that would make a great novel and maybe even a Hollywood movie. And I was like, ha ha ha, that's great, Joanna. That's a great idea, but I don't have time to do it. I'm too busy. And we left it at that. But Joanna has planted a spiritual seeds in my soul that would not subside. And for the majority of the next 2 years, I went through a conflicting period of denial, contemplation, and then finally acceptance. And it was the final nail on the coffin was when my grand uncle, who was the only person in this family who could do what I do, passed away suddenly with lung cancer in the summer of 2022. And that made me realize that, oh, I am the only surviving member of this clan left who has all the tools and the knowledge, the cultural knowledge and the language knowledge and the family stories to document these stories in the manner that I do. And if I don't do this before I die, then all of these stories will die with me forever. Over 100 years of history will die with me. And so no pressure, right? And so I finally accepted, fine, I'm going to do it. But then again, I was met with fear because how would I tackle such an overwhelming topic? How would I tackle this all by myself? It's such an epic story. So I decided that instead of trying to tackle this epic story all at once, I will break it out into small, digestible chunks and then come back and expand on the small stories later. But how do I make this attractive to the modern audience? And so on July 2022, my first Instagram reel was born, which was a reel of me cooking a recipe, one of my favorite Vietnamese recipe, tofu and tomato sauce. And the link is here if you want to get into the recipe. And on every recipe page on the website, the video is also front and center for you to watch. So I was cooking the dish in the reel And in the background, I was telling the first story. And that reel did surprisingly well for a first-time content creator. And it set the framework for the subsequent contents that would ultimately form under the Squash Vines. So in October 2022, under the Squash Vines, the brand was officially created and the website was created to be an archive for all of the recipes, the wisdoms, and stories so that all and everyone who wants it will be able to access them easily and for free. So although most of my followers are initially roped into my contents by the enticing recipes and the attractive garden, they eventually stay because of the compelling stories. So why Under the Squash Vines? Where did that name come from? So at the core, Under the Squash Vines, like I said, is a collection of recipes, wisdoms, and stories that teach us how to be the stoic calm in the storm, how to be a steward of nature, and above all, how to be human. And these cultural and ancestral wisdoms and stories are, like I said, told in the intimate backdrop of home-cooked meals and homegrown garden. I want everyone to feel like we're in the kitchen together, cooking together, and just sharing a story, like my family used to do. The name Under the Squash Vines it actually came from a joke that I like to tell my friends. If you need me, I'll be sitting under the squash vines somewhere. And through this joke, I want to convey that as an introverted hermit, the quiet and peaceful squash vines are my safe place to hide and contemplate. So that's where I spend most of my time in the summer, sitting under the squash vines like a hermit. But beyond that, in the context of Vietnamese culture, squashes also play an essential role, not just in our cuisine, but also in our folklore, proverbs, and music. One of the oldest Vietnamese proverbs that we learned before we could even read is Bầu ơi thương lấy bí cùng, cho dùng khác giống nhưng chung một dạng. By loose translations, it means, oh squash, please love gourds too. Even though we're different species, we grow under the same shades. So you can probably already get the gist of the proverb, which is treat everyone with kindness, even though they're different from you. And the essence under the squash vines is inspired by what my dad said is his hope is for home for his children. My dad always said that he hopes that his children sees his home as a place where they can always come back when they're weary and tired from the hustle and bustle of life and they need to rest. And that is what the essence I want Under the Squash Vines to be is reminiscent of home, whether literal or virtual. And if you're tired, if you're burnt out, you can always come back to this place and there will be something there for you to reflect and contemplate before you head on back out to life. Okay, so if you think of the recipes, if you think of the stories as the heart and soul of my work, then the recipes are the lungs that deliver the nourishments to the heart of the stories. And many times the recipes directly inspire the stories themselves. So because of that, I want to honor these Vietnamese recipes with it, like I said, in the light that they deserve, which is beyond the lens of social media fetishization and colonization. And what do I mean by that? So if you do a quick Google search for Vietnamese food, this is a typical image that will come up, which is, I'm not gonna say it's a lie because we do eat these food. It's a depiction of a feast. And this depiction is consistent with what you see depicted on social media, food vloggers, and the explosion of Vietnamese food's popularity on social media in recent years was fueled by the food vlogger trends. And I'm grateful for it because it brought Vietnamese cuisine on a global scale, but it has also created an unrealistic and almost fetishized representation of Vietnamese food. If you look at the typical representation of Vietnamese food in social media, you would think that we all eat pho and egg roll vermicelli bowl and crepes and spring roll every day. And while these dishes are important to our national and cultural identity, they are simply too costly and too time consuming to be a part of our everyday meal. So, so at Under the Squash Vines, I want to make sure that while I do represent the national tourist attracting dishes, on the other side of that, I want to show these simple, ordinary family meals that we eat every day. What is usually not usually showcased on social media because they're not Instagram worthy. Um, the components of a typical Vietnamese family meal is a stir-fry dish, a braised dish, a soup dish, and they're all served with white jasmine rice. And the family portion, and they're served on a platter, and we all gather around the platter at the end of the day, and we eat together. And while they are not as glamorous as the giant bowl of pho that you see on social media, they are still just as delicious and nutritious. And these are the dishes that our parents cook for us after a long 8 to 12 hours day of work. A lot of times they cook the national dishes for tourists outside and they come home and this is all the time and resources they have to cook for us. And that is totally fine. And these dishes should also be showcased. These dishes are meant to be frugal and can be put together in under 45 minutes. And if you look at how I structure the recipes of the website, they are broken out into these three typical categories. And you can also click on the links to learn more. So with that, I'm going to take 1 minute and show you and play this YouTube video. And this was actually one of my most successful videos to summarize the sentiments that I've spoken with you in the last few minutes regarding our family meals. So I'm going to go ahead and click play. I can't remember when Vietnamese food became fetishized and sensationalized in the age of social media food vloggers. But when I think of the Vietnamese food I grew up with, a gluttonous bowl of pho the size of my head or a single serving plate topped with a giant piece of grilled pork chop don't exactly come to mind. Rather, I think of a humble shared family meal comprised of mostly jasmine rice, a staple crop to fill our bellies, a sauteed vegetable dish to give us strength, and if we could afford it, a small protein dish to add flavors, all tied together with a bowl of soup meant to wash down our food in between mindful bites and share conversations. These meals, though unglamorous, are what our parents cooked after a long day of work to nourish us while we gather around the family platter under the pitter-patter sound of raindrops dancing on the tin roof of that 360 square foot childhood home where I learned the wisdoms and stories of my people. All right, so now that you have an idea of how I weave the recipes into the storytelling. You can always go back to the website and click on any of the recipes, and there will be the video front and center for you to watch. So when I think of colonial erasure of Asian cultural identities, there's no better example or worse examples that come to my mind than the term Asian salad, which is a term that's commonly used in Western restaurants and food bloggers. And when I hear Asian salads, I'm very confused. Which Asian salad are you talking about? uh, in the West, Asian salads it usually means like a salad that's comprised of iceberg lettuce, mandarin slices, sesame seeds, soy sauce, and wonton crisps. But Asian is not a monolith, and an Asian salad can be any one of these three, but these definitely do not represent all Asian salads. But these are three very different, distinct and widely diverse flavor profiles. Korean with muchim salad, that's the famous English cucumber salad with the red pepper paste. Filipino mango salad with shrimp paste, and a Vietnamese gỏi gà salad, which is a shredded cabbage with Vietnamese mint that gives it that special flavor, cilantro, peanuts, chili, and with a fish sauce. Last I checked, none of these salads have canned mandarin slices in them. And last I checked, I don't know of any Vietnamese salads that has canned mandarin slices in them. So I don't know how mandarin slices become synonymous with Asian salads in the West. But that is where we are. And I just want to be for us all to be mindful that Asian salad is not really a thing, and that we should be looking at every single culture and their own identity. So I have an example, a couple of examples here from the website of two Vietnamese salads that are the flavors are completely different from each other. One is the gỏi gà, which is the shredded cabbage salad that I've mentioned earlier, and the link is there too if you want to look at it. And there's the papaya salad, which is papaya based with some with a totally different soy sauce dressing. So there's a link too if you want to take a look at it. So food authenticity, why I appreciate it, I think it's overrated. Why? Because although I aim to honor the original essence of every Vietnamese dish, I do not strive for authenticity or the narrow borders of cultural purity. Because despite what the Uncle Rogers and the food purists of the world say, food authenticity is overrated. All cuisines are cross-culturally influenced. Destitution is the mother of reinvention and resourcefulness. So our Vietnamese mothers who were running from bombs and hiding from battles in the jungle, they would never turn up their nose and dismiss an ingredient that is available to them just because it isn't considered authentic to the original dish. No, they were too busy trying to figure out how to feed their family and keep their family safe. And the force behind our survival after so many centuries of war, poverty, and colonialism is our adaptability to whatever resources we have on hand. So as I show on this picture here, I had a lot of tomatillos growing in the garden. I had to do something with them. I can't waste them. So I made a dish that is a fusion of the Vietnamese fermentation method with the Korean gochujang paste and I created a gochujang fermented tomatillo dish. Is it authentic to Vietnamese or Korean? Absolutely not. Is it delicious and nutritious? Absolutely yes. So, and that is exactly what our mothers and grandmothers would do. Do what you can with what you have. This is the true wisdom of our ancestors. And that, the link is also there under the picture if you want to get the recipe. Oh, I've been flying by this lecture. Okay. So now that I walk you through my vision of how I want to represent Vietnamese food on my platform, I now let's walk through how I weave these recipes into the stories that I tell to form one cohesive narrative that ultimately is the heart of my work, telling my family stories and my people's stories. So at the core of my work, I use food as the backdrop to weave history and culture together in an intimate storytelling format. These stories are told through the perspective of my family members and my own lived experiences in Vietnam. And the timeline of these stories spans over 100 years of colonialism, war, reconstruction, and the modern urbanization of Vietnam. Starting with my great-grandmother, who in 1920, at the age of 15, was working as a merchant under her family's business. And every week she would travel upstream to the highland on the Da River in a tiny boat with other merchants to conduct their business. And on these boat trips, she would recite classic Vietnamese literature to entertain her fellow boatmates who were illiterate. She was only 15 and she never was afforded the formal education that her male family members were. But she could recite these works. So imagine if somebody recite from memories, Shakespeare's and Oedipus. That was her. And she could analyze these works better than college professors. She was the original storyteller on the Da River. But of course, there were harrowing tales of war that fed into our generational trauma, specifically, mostly from the perspective of my grandparents, who are shown in this picture. They both brought their fair share of trauma into a marriage that was contentious and disastrous from the start. My grandmother, after all, saw her father being killed by the French colonizers that I mentioned earlier. My grandfather was abandoned by his mother at the age of 7. And to make matters even more tense, my grandfather worked as one of the highest ranking intelligence officer for the Southern Army, the side that was defeated. When the war ended, when Saigon fell in 1975, his punishment, if he had stayed, would have been death. But luckily, he was able to escape on that boat with my grandmother and his other children. Unfortunately, my father did not make it on that boat. And throughout the next 12 years of the post-war reconstruction period under an oppressive and vengeful communist regime, what the communist regime could not do to my grandfather, they saved all that wrath to rain down on my father. And so during those 12 years, it was hell for my parents and my sibling. Many stories came out of that period. One of them was the death of my 6-month-old sister, because my father was not allowed to buy medicine and food for her. This was an event that he later would write in our family Catholic sacramental book as the most devastating moments of Dad's life. But things did eventually get better. There was a light at the end of this long tunnel because there was one thing that the communists could never take away from from my father, and that was his knowledge. And the key knowledge that they needed from him was his fluent English skills, which came into play when the US and Vietnam economic relations finally improved during the open door period, starting in the mid 1980s. All the way until now, which during this period, Vietnam went through a huge, rapid cultural economic shifts and modern day urbanization, which built the tourist attracting Vietnam that you know today on social media. So, and that was mainly the period that I was conscious of in my stories because I was born in 1987. So those are the four major timelines that I focus on in my stories. So now let's go through how a few examples of how these recipes are weaved into the stories, and sometimes they are an integral part of the story. Let's start with Mien Ga, which is a northern style noodle dish. It's made with glass vermicelli noodles. And when the Geneva Accord deadline took place July 21st, 1954, that accord divided Vietnam into two states, the communist-controlled North and the southern state of Vietnam separated at the 17th parallel line. It would effectively shut down all travels between the two zones. Just a few days before this deadline took place, my great-grandmother planned a successful evacuation of her children out of the communist-controlled zone. And she did this with such calculating composure that no one would have guessed that she had just recently buried her husband. And she did this without telling a single soul, not even the children that she was carrying. She carried her youngest son in a basket hanging from her shoulder to travel out of the North Zone. As soon as they crossed into the safe zone in Hue, she immediately took to cooking and selling Mien Ga, this soup, on the street to support her family. My great-grandmother, as I said, came from the most affluent and prestigious family in the region of Sơn Tây in the north. She was formally trained in business and Eastern medicine. She had helpers, nannies at home cooking for her while she was on her business trips. So cooking was never her forte, but like all immigrants who were casualties of war, who lost everything to war, she had to do what she had to do in order to survive and to feed her family. And that just gives you an idea of her strength. So this recipe is extremely important in the arsenal of our family history. Moving on to the 1960s and 1970s, the height of the Vietnam War, I learned from one of my family members. She's my grand aunt who was married to my grand uncle. Actually, she's this woman right here in the picture. She told me that during these years, 3 generations of my family, my dad included, used to cram together in a duplex in Saigon. And I learned from her that every day, the women of the family would go to the market and purchase these items to cook their daily meals. tofu and scallions, and that's it. And they would season these two ingredients with soy sauce and fish sauce, and that was the daily meal. And my family was actually more well-to-do than most of the population. And as meager as this original meal was, I acknowledge that it is the reason why I am alive today, because it fed my dad. And but now I have the luxury of reinventing this recipe with more spices and flavors to make it more luxurious. And so I add chilies and garlic and lemongrass and some other sauces to make it super delicious. And the link is right there if you want to take a look at it. But I still want to honor the original intention of the dish. Bún riêu is a tomato-based soup and is one of my favorite Vietnamese recipes. And this one is actually very close to my heart because when I was 4 years old, my first experience with death is when my cousin Mai Si, who was 3 years old, passed away from dengue fever, a disease that could have been easily prevented with a mosquito net, a shot, some ibuprofen. But Vietnam at that time was going through a period of growing pain. We were trying to learn. We were still trying to learn after coming out of decades-long civil war. And we didn't have much of that knowledge or resources. And so Mai Si had to die. And Mai Si's mother, who's not my biological aunt, but she used to take care of us, is arguably the best cook in our family. Of course, Mai Si's death took away a piece of her heart that would never return. And to add insult to injury, my aunt later found out that she would never have biological children again due to medical reasons. My favorite dish that Mai Si's mom cooked for us is this dish, bún riêu, and it brings me memories of those Sunday evenings when we all gather at grandma's house and sit under the mango tree and read comic books, and she would make us this delicious dish. And that is why I cook this dish while I honor Mai Si's story. Broken rice and egg loaf is another Vietnamese delicacy that is extremely close to my heart. And if you don't know, broken rice is the rice that's left over at the bottom of the barrel after they process the good rice. The rice grains are broken. So it releases this delicious starchiness that has a very distinct taste. It used to be that poor farmers would eat broken rice after they sell the good rice, but now everyone has discovered that it is delicious, so it has become a national delicacy. So during the late 1990s and late 2010s, the periods that I grew up, Vietnam underwent a period of immense infrastructure development and change fueled by foreign investors who saw Vietnam's potential as the next ASEAN economic superpower. These changes, while I acknowledge that ultimately uplifted the country's standard of living as a whole, I don't deny that. But through these changes, there were real casualties from human and nature that were cast aside and uncompensated. We ourselves lost half of our house when the bulldozers came, and we lost my grandfather's mango tree. Many poor street merchants were uprooted, like dispensable water hyacinths during the urbanization process. And if you don't know, water hyacinths is a term that we use in Vietnamese music and literature to symbolize the poor, the fate of the poor, because The water hyacinths are rootless and disposable to society. Here today, gone tomorrow. Um, so one of these casualties was a kind little lady who we only knew as the broken rice lady by the riverbank. We didn't even know her name. That's all we called her. And her broken rice shack was across the street from my house, right along the bank of the Domnai River. And to this day, I have never met a match for her broken rice and egg loaf or cơm tấm chả trứng. And when I came back to Vietnam to visit in 2011, and I found out that her shack has been uprooted in the name of commerce development, I was devastated. And the riverbanks that I once loved now is a cement paved business district worthy of tourists. So to keep her alive, her legacy alive, I wanted to tell her story while recreating her signature dish. And it's the dish that I ate almost every day before or after school. But of course, not all of my stories are sad and gloom and dooms. There are also uplifting moments also. Um, One of them is this very special dish to me. I call it That's Cure Everything Cháo or congee. Cháo is congee in Vietnam. Um, and the story behind that is very funny and interesting. When I was 12 years old, we were already living in the US. And I came down with the worst flu of my life. And my mom was working her weekend shift at Red Lobsters. Like most immigrant families, my mom and dad usually had 4 to 5 jobs between the two of them. And so they had to take turn taking care of us, and they barely saw each other. So while I was feverish and delirious, I could hear my dad clumsily fumbling with the pots and pans in the kitchen. And then 1 hour later, he brought to my bedside what looks to be this bowl of raw onions, garlic, and ginger at the top, and a little bit of congee and boiled chicken at the bottom. And he told me this soup would cure everything, I promise you. And my dad is not a good cook. So that soup was not the easiest thing to eat. But what my dad is an expert in Eastern medicine and um, herbal remedies. So he knew that potent combination of raw onion, garlic, and ginger would work. And it worked because it cured me the next day. So I'm older now and I'm a much better cook than my dad. I reinvented his original recipe with and made it delicious, but I still retain the original spirit of the dish, which is onion, garlic, and ginger, because a wise man once told me it cures everything, and I still believe it. So if you're sick, this recipe is a lifesaver. So to wrap it up, why do I tell these stories? What is the point besides the familial responsibility to do it? One of my favorite quotes is from Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, that chronicled his life in the Nazi concentration camp. And he says, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances and to choose one's own way. And I can see no better example of this lesson than from my family stories, because although many of the stories are harrowing and sad, at the end of the day, they also exhibit resilience, strength, and dignity in the face of oppression and tragedy. Though we could not control our external circumstances, we don't have to let them control us. And there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and this too shall pass. And that is what I want my audience to learn from my wisdoms and stories. So thank you so much again for listening and engaging with the lecture today. We'll move on to the Q&A section of the lecture now. And before we go, here are some additional resources from the website that I'm going to put here for your information. Like I said, under the squash vines, it's at the core, the heart is stories and wisdoms, but there are also gardens and arts and other folklore and cultural stuff that I think everyone would be able to find something they need here. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Fiona. I think
Yeah, thank you so much.